Good evening. I think we should start. There are still some seats in the North Jury room. Maybe we should just try and get people squeezed in at the back. It's a great pleasure to introduce an old friend and colleague, Griselda Pollock, to give this evening's talk. The account of the talk, I must say, leaves me feeling somewhat sort of disabled at the AA, since it puts forward various themes about Freud in a much more kind of direct and straightforward way than I would normally choose myself to do, while recognizing that they're absolutely kind of central to the investigation of Freud's relation to culture, and especially to kind of built culture. You probably don't need any introduction to the work of Griselda from me. She's currently Professor of Social and Critical Histories of Art and Director of the AHRB Centre for Cultural Analysis, which was generous enough to sponsor my lectures on Odysseus and Homecoming. She's known to most of you for her work establishing a feminist approach and point of view to art history, and has published widely on that basis. Many of you will know her work, Old Mistresses, and more recently, Differencing the Canon and Looking to the Future, essays on art, life, and death. Over the years, Griselda's work has also kind of expanded, and she now, her school at Leeds University, I think, is one of the most interesting places for this kind of work, has expanded to concern itself with issues of trauma in culture, and more specifically on the Holocaust and what you might call the kind of artistic response to the Holocaust. In a sense, in the whole relation between Jewish art and modernity. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Griselda Pollock here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I hope I'll make sense of, or make either suitably complex or suitably frank some of the thoughts I have about Freud, and maybe we'll take them up in discussion now. I'm going to have, can I have the first? Okay. That's going to come up. Okay, if I could sing, I would start with a rousing chorus of a famous Beatles song, Let Me Take You Down, but not to strawberry fields, but to a famous street. Where else but in Vienna? The date is 1938, and we approach slowly, as we would were we to be a patient or analysand of the famous occupants of this extremely elegant and large apartment on Berggasse, or Mountain Street. Our virtual journey into this auspicious and historic interior is possible thanks to this man, to Edmund Egelman, who took a series of photographs clandestinely under the eyes of the Gestapo in March 1938, 10 days before Dr. Freud and his family were able to escape from Vienna through the interventions of Marie Bonaparte and the US government. The photographs were therefore taken on the eve of the doctor's flight, without flashlights or floodlights, under the constant surveillance of the Gestapo, who were afraid that people would smuggle treasures into the Freud apartment, since Freud had permission to remove, when he left, the contents of his apartment, namely his books and his treasures. The image with which our access will halt is the consulting room, which you can see where it is on this, don't know if I can get you a little bit more focus there, the consulting room up on the left. The consulting room is perhaps the mise en scène of Freud's psychoanalytical practice, complete with his extensive collection of antiquities, which surrounded both Freud himself and the analysand during their sessions. Let us move on again with Freud to suburban London, where we have an unauthored photograph that is the reconstructed consulting room at Freud's Hampstead home in Maresfield Gardens, where now the same ensemble, as you see in Engelmann's photographs, has been recreated as a historical installation within the Freud Museum. It is now a site of remembrance and an archive that lacks the labyrinthine quality of the original apartments and their cumulative historical display of Freud's history, of Freud's relationship to history via image and object. Both photographs document more than a room. They represent the site of Freud's psychological anthropology, his fieldwork. Engelmann's photographs offer us a visual image of the analytical theatre, where furniture and fittings have been selected to create the material environment for the analytic couple's time travel. The here and now of the reclining analysand would be suspended and then fractured by the surfacing of buried memories or mnemic fragments from childhood that are no longer accessible in full to the adult consciousness, they nonetheless overdetermine. In that space of induced reverie and daydream, the adult falls back into an active relationship with his or her own prehistory and experiences his or her own subjectivity as a complex of sedimented layers that are also interleaved temporal strata, resurfacing across the plane of language and the speaking or silenced body. Although contemporaneous with Marcel Proust's literary and autobiographical reflections on childhood as affect-laden time recovered through a detail in the present that triggers the collapse of the membrane between past and present, the Freudian model of memory suggested here by this space is radically different. It is far more tragic and necessarily opaque. For Freud, memory is never, as for Proust, a recoverable world of sensation and emotion, but rather the rebus-like archaeological remnant of unfinished business that hinges the subject and human culture forever between an incomplete past and a never fully experienced present. As George Dimmock has argued in his important study of Freud's consulting rooms, the furnishings, pictures and objects can be read as an unconscious or dream text of their author, Freud himself. They invite a reading of Freud's mind that takes us to the heart of both the Freudian paradox and that of modernity itself. For why did the atheist neuropsychologist, promoting his work as a new science, live intellectually and affectively in a world populated by these fragmentary bearers of science's antithesis, namely mythopoetical, cultic, and pagan religious thinking? Why is there so much art in the space of medical science? Not for Freud, Gauguin's Oceania, or Picasso's Africa, but Egypt, Greece, the Sphinx of course, Rome, China, and whether you call it Israel or Jewish culture, Yerushalayim, who's written an interesting book, draws attention to these two little Kiddush cups the cups used on Friday nights and Jewish blessing of the wine, which appear amongst these Chinese things. You will notice in subsequent photographs they disappear. So here we have Egypt, Greece, China, Rome, and Israel, as it were, that spoke to and of Freud's desire, to and of Freud's childhood dreams, framed in a Jewish heritage within a Germano-Christian world. The space we now see through Engelmann's photographs was that of Freud's profession, yet it is also the metonym of Freud himself, the multidisciplinary scholar, reading archaeology, art history, anthropology, and from here we have Freud with Michelangelo's Dying Slave, and from 1896 onwards, Freud passionately collected antiquities using their presence in what Rina Ransoff calls the sense of ages to frame his own writing. Now the second room, this is the one in Maresfield Gardens, a luminously simple interior, locates the famous couch directly beneath a print that hangs between the Library of Books and a print of the Roman Forum, itself a signifier of Freud's link with his own father, Jakob Freud. The central print is almost too familiar these days. It is André Bruyère's painting of Le Leçon de Mardi à Salpêtrière, the Tuesday lectures at Salpêtrière, in which the 19th century neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot lectures to an assembled audience within a medical frame, while his assistants hold the fainting body of a woman patient in mute hysterical collapse. The relation of couch to icon reads as Freud's claimed descent from and declared rivalry with the French neurologist, whose innovative work on hysteria as a structurally explicable organic disease set the young Freud, working in Paris in 1885-6, on his uncertain path to the invention of psychoanalysis. Un visuel, a very visual person, as Freud described Charcot in his memoir of 1893, a man of, quote, artistically gifted temperament, allowing himself to be absorbed by a long and close visual scrutiny of appearances until they yielded system in place of superficial chaos. Charcot is represented in a formal medical setting, lecturing in the presence of his possessed but silent and mentally absented female object of demonstration. But this scenario is, however, structurally opposed to the scene of analysis over which it appears to preside, a scene that is as private as it is dialogic, as acoustic as it is intimate. We note the chair at the head of the sofa for the analyst himself, represented by a place in a transsubjective structural exchange that Freud would theorize as transference. You see the chair here, and the chair, Freud's position, is just to the head of the couch. You can just see the edge of the chair. Now, the original Viennese rooms utilized the same couch, covered with the complex patterns and motifs of oriental carpets and cushions, yet these are set in an utterly different cultural decor and signifying environment. Dark walls, a warming ceramic stove, and the clutter of pictures on the walls and objects in cabinets and on shelves. Directly above the couch in Vienna hung a colored gouache, a colored gouache, there you have it, by Ernst Kerner, 1907, showing the vast cliff temples of built by Ramses II at Abu Simnel, massively signifying both the fascination with the past of human civilizations and especially with the Egyptian cult of death, against which the sculpted image stands fetishistically as both attempted defeat and monumental petrified reminder of inevitable mortality. Egypt is present in other parts of the room and other parts of the collection, as here this little statue of Isis suckling Horus from the 26th dynasty, 664 to 525 before the Common Era, if you're really an Egyptologist, and Isis and Osiris, of course, are the archetypal images of the resurrection myth that reappear in Christianity, in which the dying resurrected husband Osiris and the son Horus are conflated. Here is a head of Isis. No, Osiris, I'm sorry, this is the Osiris one. This is Isis and the son Horus, and this is Osiris. In Christianity, the dying resurrected husband Osiris and the son Horus are conflated into the crucified and resurrected son. Now, Susan Bernfeld has even argued that Freud's love of archaeology can itself be psychoanalyzed as the sublimation of childhood traumas, such as the death of a baby brother and the disappearance of his Czech Catholic nursemaid. The digging up of the lost past stands for a kind of resurrection unavailable to a Jewish child, though learnt of through his Catholic nanny and transformed into an analytical model that offers a mastery over the lost time, as well as a way to live beyond religion. Now, in reading this array of images as an art installation that can itself be deciphered like a dream text, George Dimmock cites Freud's early invocation of the archaeological metaphor in his text of 1896, The Etiology of Hysteria, from which I quote, "Imagine an explorer arrives in a little-known region where his interest is aroused by an expanse of ruins. He may well content himself with inspecting what lies there on the surface and with questioning the people who live nearby about what tradition tells of the history and meaning of these monumental remains, and taking notes of their statements. And then he might go on his way. But he equally might act differently. He may have brought picks and shovels and spades with him, and he may press the inhabitants into his service and arm them with these tools to make an onslaught on the ruins, clearing away the rubbish, and starting from the visible remains, he may bring to light what is buried. By such a method, Freud argues, the archaeologist may uncover enough remains, tablets, inscriptions, an alphabet, even a language, sufficient to produce undreamed-of information about the events of the past to commemorate which these monuments were built. Thus the past can leave a fractured trace. Deep excavations alone allowed some reconstruction of what these remains, themselves already signifying images, commemorate, the ambiguous term at the heart of Freud's thesis on fetishism. What is excavated is therefore a culture's mnemonic, inviting speculation about those elements significant enough to create for their remembrance a cultural form and to initiate a cultural practice that can leave remains. Yet this invocation of archaeology is not at all straightforward. You may recall the famous analogy in Notes upon a Case of Obsessional Neurosis, known to us as the Rat Man in 1909, in which Freud reported in an almost conversational way the exchange between himself and his patient, where the association of archaeology and psychoanalysis proves more paradoxical. I quote, "I then made some short observations upon the psychological differences between the conscious and the unconscious, and upon the fact that everything conscious was subject to a process of wearing away, while the unconscious was relatively unchangeable. And I illustrated my remarks by pointing to the antiques standing about in my room. They were, in fact, only objects found in a tomb, and their burial had in fact been their preservation." He went on to say, and I quote again, "The destruction of Pompeii was only the beginning. Now that it has been dug up, it will disappear." Was there any guarantee, he next inquired, of what one's attitude would be towards what was discovered? "No," said I, this is Freud speaking, "it followed from the nature of the circumstances that in every case the effect would be overcome for the most part during the process of work itself." Freud therefore makes an important distinction, and again I quote, "Every effort was made to preserve Pompeii, whereas people are anxious to be rid of tormenting ideas like his." The formative phases and events of human childhood, the archaic memories and feelings, are preserved like artifacts in the tombs of ancient civilizations by the mechanism of the unconscious. They are buried and preserved there. If analysis is like excavation or even exhumation, It exposes this preserved past to the present, therefore to the dynamic transformation called working through. But in the case of exhumed artifacts, culture's guardians aim for perpetual conservation, for which we have created the museum and its new cult priests, the art historians. Is the museum, I ask, a transparent tomb or an amnesiac's memory bank? The analyst, on the other hand, seeks to bring about change in the analysand, relieving him or her of anxieties and phobias generated in childhood that in fact deprive him of the effects of time. You get held back to these knots, these psychic knots. Furthermore, the archaeological metaphor invoking a succession between the buried past of childhood and adult self-understanding raises further problems. We may treat exhumed civilizations as a kind of infantile prehistory of the present. As we know, the present of the late 19th century bourgeoisie, what is called the modern, became precisely in such a progressive teleology synonymous with adulthood. It seemed as if the moderns maturely reviewed as its other and others' infantile past, whatever it discovered as these traces of lost civilizations. So the ideal visitor to the modern museum appears to confront traces of human prehistory from a safe position of distance that veils the synchronous twinning of modernity and primitivism. And if such a position were unchallenged by the fact of the human subject's perpetual working through his or her own formation, we would be unable to confront the neuroses and phobias of our own age, thinking that we had grown up and everything was as it were in the past. Hence the monetary importance I attach to the co-presence of analysis and the antiquities in Freud's working environment. He too, while listening, was un visuel, a very visual man, wanting himself to be challenged as he searched these encoded emblems of human subjectivity and cultural memory for a warning against the arrogance of modern teleology and of the claims of science, necessary as they were. For Freud, moreover, the psychoanalytical idea of the archaic and the infantile are not the same as the evolutionary concept of the primitive, for they fall not into time but into psychic space. They are a form of representation of what is perpetual in the human subject, its constitutive foundations and determinations. It is not something out of which we can simply grow. In fact, the opposite is actually true. The problems of the archaeological metaphor, therefore, for societies as for individuals, or the tensions between them, are revealed in the moment of its enunciation. What is required is to plot the varied uses of the archaeological metaphor in Freud's researches into the role of the archaic in relation to his ideal concept of adult psychological self-management and self-knowledge, in which we can catch both the trace of 19th century evolutionary progressivism and, more radically, the terms of its undermining at a point also critical to our contemporary reflections on the early histories of our disciplines in art, architecture, material culture, or psychoanalysis. Donald Cuspit names the archaeology as the mighty metaphor for psychoanalysis. I think we can, however, distinguish three different elements of that metaphor that reflect Freud's imaginative as well as professional relations with the ways that contemporary, that's to say late 19th century, early 20th century archaeology changed Western self-perceptions in his lifetime around the issues of memory and oblivion. Firstly, we have, as already seen, the Pompeii metaphor. Discovered by Domenico Fontana in the 16th century and identified in 1763 as the remains of Pompeii, the ruins were only systematically excavated by the Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli after 1860. Interpretations made possible by his careful documentation and casting were themselves only published by August Mau in his Pompeii in Leben und Kunst in 1900, the same date, of course, as the interpretation of dreams. Pompeii represents the rediscovery of an almost complete classical city preserved in its everyday complexity by the freak of ashen burial beneath the eruption of Vesuvius in 1709 of the Common Era. before the Common Era. Pompeii is a model for the Freudian proposition that human psyches forget nothing, and the entirety of our infantile period is repressed beneath the somewhat more solid barrier of an impenetrable unconscious. Secondly, we can identify the Troy metaphor. The possible discovery of a real historical Troy entered popular knowledge through the German Schliemann's widely reported excavations of the mound at Hisarlik in Asia Minor in the 1870s. Schliemann not only claimed to have found what he took to be the Bronze Age civilization of Troy, and later the culture of Mycenae in the Greek Peloponnese, his digging also brought to light 8 further strata indicating even older civilizations preceding what had up to that moment been presumed to be only legend or myth. Schliemann's much more rigorous archaeological collaborator, a real professional, Wilhelm Dürpfeld, applied new techniques of stratigraphy, that's to say the study of strata, to the Trojan sites, a method that was then illustrated in Schliemann's popular writings in a suggestively evocative manner of the section drawing. And I'm sorry this is not the most beautiful slide, but it's a very interesting exemplar of the artistic register of this archaeological stratification. Now, what does the Troy metaphor do for us? Well, first of all, knowledge of world prehistory was thus radically extended by the discovery of a material record of superimposed layered deposits of persistent occupations of one site. For psychoanalysis, therefore, the Troy metaphor is a much more dialectical metaphor of sedimentation and stratification. A single site, like the human subject, is a composite of its own many histories, each period laid down like a stratum, once the site of life and energy, which is then superseded by that which occupies the same space, incorporating into different usages and meaning relics of the former strata. An altar becomes a door lintel. Nothing is forgotten, but nothing remains unchanged, and each element is dynamically transformed by the multiple levels, and what appears on the surface as it were the conscious face of the adult is merely the tip of a deep shaft that needs to be excavated layer by layer in a series of interacting and perpetually mutually transformed relations. We see this model perfectly demonstrated in Freud's structuring of his superb 1914 analysis of the so-called Wolfman. In this text, Freud moves back layer by layer. He hypothesizes a primal scene occurring in early infancy at a moment when this subject had too underdeveloped a psyche to process what it nonetheless traumatically witnessed. Freud then shows how subsequent phases of psychic, linguistic, and physical development retrospectively catch up the mnemic traces, reshaping them with meanings dependent upon further maturation, fantasy, and language acquisition. Thus, the human subject is imagined in a time-reversing relay that binds its prehistory, pre-language, and pre-Oedipal processes to the retrospective structuration of an always later but always earlier symbolic. The subject is deemed to be formed through accretion and reframing, just as a long-occupied single site might yield its layers, each one shaped by and reshaping its own foundations. Using this archaeological terminology, Freud wrote to Wilhelm Fliess in 1896, and I quote, "I am working on the assumption that our psychical mechanism has come into being by a process of stratification, the material present in the form of memory traces being subjected from time to time to a rearrangements in accordance with fresh circumstances, to a constant retranscription." From this proposition derives Freud's key concept of Nachträglichkeit, deferred action, the après-coup, a concept central to contemporary critical feminist studies in the histories of art and material culture. Feminist studies radically oppose the linearity of predominant developmental models of art history, since femininity has always been situated as both the repressed other of phallocentric thought and its figured negation. Its marginal enigmatic status is therefore always, as it were, that which is, as it were, outside or cast into prehistory or pre-linguistic or pre-Oedipal, therefore, in a sense, interestingly connected with our redefining of the nature of the archaic. Feminist thought has suggested that meanings, for instance, of certain artistic practices may only emerge in a retrospect when later outcomes allow us to circle back and retrieve earlier traces in the light of theoretical and artistic shifts that these earlier unremembered events themselves helped to occasion. Thus, for instance, the radical ruptures of feminist and lesbian culture in the 1920s occur, as it were, traumatically in a culture unable to assimilate them, but then, as it were, in some ways they give rise to what will re-emerge in the 1970s to become the forms of theorization by which at last we can begin to think what actually happened in the 20s, thus leaving us far from the notion of development. We actually are, as it were, we are the deferred action of the 20s, which was, as it were, interrupted by the horrors of fascism and the incorporation of fascist gender ideologies into mainstream culture post-World War II. Now, the third model is provided by the Cretan site of an ancient civilization, of a Minoan civilization older than Troy and even of Mycenae at Knossos. The use of Knossos as a metaphor emerges much later in Freud's writings, corresponding to the publication of Sir Arthur Evans's excavations at Knossos on the island of Crete after 1900. Schliemann had suspected that there would be another culture to be found, and he tried to dig in Crete but was unsuccessful in obtaining permission from the ruling Turkish authorities. In 1899, Arthur Evans, curator at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, successfully purchased from the Turkish authorities the tract of land on which the vast complex known as Knossos was to be fully uncovered. Filled with mythic stories and legends from his classical British upper-class education, Evans identified the many-storied buildings he found with the labyrinth of Greek myth and named the culture he uncovered Minoan, after King Minos of the Theseus and the Minotaur stories. At Knossos, 3,000 clay tablets were found bearing the script named Linear B, which were later deciphered by Michael Ventris, and Evans's key publications were the Scripta Minoa of 1909 and the Palace of Minos, 1921, in several volumes running until 1936. These dates relate, of course, crucially to major shifts in Freud's own thinking, especially about sexuality and later femininity. Now, the Knossos metaphor is a model of cultural rupture and loss, revealing a formerly unknown and utterly different civilization screened behind what had been taken to be the earliest foundations of the history of the West. Following the revelation of Minoan culture, Freud was obliged to theorize a subject violently forced from one functional model of psychic life into another, just as Minoan culture was violently overthrown by Mycenaean. And this model has specific implications for Freud's incomplete theory of femininity and for the place of the maternal in subjective formation. In 1931, Freud famously wrote on his essay on female sexuality, and I quote, "Our insight into this early pre-Oedipus phase in girls comes to us as a surprise, just like the discovery in another field of the Minoan Mycenaean civilizations behind that of Greece." I want, therefore, to argue that it is only through keeping distinct these three different culturally generated metaphors of the past, its relics and memories, that we can appreciate the role of the archaeological metaphor in terms of what it enabled Freud to think. Equally, we may use psychoanalysis to reflect back upon the desire of the archaeologists, and therefore of any historians. What do we desire when we research into the past, and why do we do it? A clue emerges as we follow Engelmann's tour of the room. Okay, let's go back to this room. And note that as Freud sat and listened, he was framed, there is this thing, by Pompeian fragments of the figures of, what have I done here, of Pan, various Egyptian mummies, and then this wonderful bust of a very, very proper Roman citizen. And he would contemplate a collection. Let me just think about this. There's the bust. From his chair, he would contemplate a collection of tiny figurines, many of which were Egyptian, including the falcon-headed Horus. Let me just see if we can... Yeah, okay, now if I just... The falcon-headed Horus is just here. Oops. There. And then that's the actual image. Now, the illustrations from the famous Philipson Bible, which you see a plate here, read to him by his father in childhood and rebound and given as a present for his 35th birthday, had made vivid to Freud the Egyptian deities whose visualization was so prescribed by the aniconic second commandment of Jewish law. Now, this is just an extraordinary, a Hebrew-German Bible with all this illustration of the abominations of the Egyptians. It itself is an object of really serious and interesting study. Anyway, in his 50s, Freud recalled an anxiety dream that he had had as a young boy about his mother's death, where he imagined that she was being carried on a bier, or bier, by bird-headed attendants, derived, he thought, from such pictures of Egyptian funerary reliefs with which he now surrounded himself in the imaginary tomb space of his consulting rooms. This links with Freud's perhaps most famous identification with the world of archaeology that was bringing these exhumed antiquities, rather than their imaginative reconstruction in contemporary visual images, back into the world. In a letter to Fliess, Freud told his friend of his purchase as a birthday present to himself in 1899 of Schliemann's Ilios. This autobiographical study also featured an image encountered in childhood in Georg Ludwig Gerer's Universal History for Children, which was published in 1828 and was given to Schliemann in 1829 as a Christmas gift. In that volume, Schliemann, who had been fired by his father's thrilling accounts of the legendary heroics of ancient Troy, encountered a reproduction of a painting, a contemporary and imagined reconstruction of the burning of Troy, with Aeneas carrying Anchises and Ascanius through the fiery Scaean gate. The vividness of the artistic envisioning of the classics by the artist convinced the child Schliemann that Troy had not been destroyed and lost forever. The image served as a proof text, a cultural memory that must lead back to the traces of a real event. Despite his father's dismissal of the picture as mere fancy, Schliemann determined that one day he would find the real Troy to reclaim the physical foundation of the stories that inspired his own childhood imagination and ambition. Thus, for Freud, Schliemann was a happy man, quote, when he found the treasure of Priam, since the only happiness is the satisfaction of a childhood wish. In an earlier letter, Freud had written, quote, happiness is the subsequent fulfillment of a prehistoric wish. That is why wealth brings so little happiness. Money was never a wish of childhood. Freud used Schliemann in two ways. Schliemann's uncovering of a material historical foundation for what had hitherto been considered purely legendary lent support for Freud's suggestion that the adult stories we tell and the images we make as writers, artists, or dreamers screen historic events from our individual past that we no longer consciously remember. Secondly, Schliemann's case, as it were, shows how adult actions are to be themselves analyzed as the unconscious outcome of prehistoric wishes. The contemporary skepticism or frank agnosticism about what Schliemann actually uncovered in Turkey or what Evans recreated at the Knossos site, which still perplex archaeologists today as to what they've actually got in front of them, only confirms that the impulse for the foundations of our disciplines needs scrutiny. They are the project or projection of our desires, not the discoveries of history. Psychoanalysis, founded at the same generation as the key figures in anthropology, archaeology, and art history, shared the mentality and ideology of that historic moment, but it offers within its own methodology a monetary model for desire, i.e. for transference. And this operates acutely in the dangerous elision of childhood and the prehistoric, and both with the primitive, a classic instance of a widespread way of thinking that infantilizes those elements of human cultures and civilizations that appear chronologically anterior to, and thus diverge structurally and aesthetically, from whatever it is that modern Western Europeans define as the moment of history. Anything that's called prehistoric is seen to be, as it were, in this category of the other. Insofar as the story that Freud himself tells, the legend of psychoanalysis, is a representation of a historically situated 19th century conception of difference opposing childhood and adulthood, prehistory and history, and we must admit mother worlds and father worlds, we might be tempted to accept these distinctions and the valuations placed upon them. But insofar as Freud was himself the author and symptomatic site of the articulation of a profound insight into the human psyche he helped to represent, we can decipher through his texts much more of a conflict, of a tension, of even a repression around what it is in childhood of the individual or Western culture as a whole that is so powerful and yet so forbidden that it must be buried, surfacing only as the revenant, the return of the repressed. And this is where the Knossos model becomes an important corrective to any residual developmental Eurocentricism contained in an unqualified use of the archaeological metaphor. I have already quoted Freud's reference to the work of Evans on the notion of the correlation between the discovery of a pre-Oedipus phase in femininity and the Minoan-Mycenaean civilization predating Greece. The association is clearly between a period in the life of the female child in which the mother's role is vast and formative and the psychoanalytically sustainable, and a period in which the archaeological record suggests, through images of mother-daughter goddess cults, so there's this parallel between the importance of the mother in the life of the child and the period which the archaeological record reveals, a period in which mother goddess cults, daughter cults were dominant, and then they were violently replaced by the phallocentric social law of the father signalled in the worship of the sky gods. Freud's legend, like all phallocentric myths, tells the story of the becoming of the subject through the ordeal and adventure of escaping that originary realm of the maternal body and that psychic space which is allowed to leave no trace and be constitutive of no adult structures. Yet the discovery of a psychic Minoan world, given that that material one appeared to Evans to be a very sophisticated and elaborate culture rather than a primitive civilization, immediately puts the modernist and masculinist impulse to render this past merely a prehistoric phase under considerable pressure. With the revision of this legend, our current arrangements of sexual difference are also up for historical questioning. Now, between Schliemann's narcissistic search for the city of his childhood heroes and Evans' uncovering of the Minoan civilization with its snake goddesses and other indications of a different status for women than that in the Homeric myths of Trojan warriors, lies the repressed Freud will discover in his consulting room, but which he will consistently use the archaeological metaphor to reinter, namely the maternal feminine. As Ellen Handler Spitz so pointedly asked in her beautiful catalogue essay for the exhibition Sigmund Freud in Art of 1989, why did Freud pay so little attention to the powerful myth of Demeter and Persephone, or Demeter and Persephone, focusing relentlessly instead on the Oedipus legend? I quote, "Thus Freud, colonizing antiquity for his own purposes, closed as well as opened the territory. A tiny head of Demeter was part of his collection, but its significance was dwarfed by the massive figure of the Sphinx." I'm sorry, what should be? Oh, wait a second. Now, wait a second here. Okay, its significance was dwarfed by the massive figure of the Sphinx. The print of the Sphinx of Giza stands over the door between Freud's office and his rooms, and hung on the wall to which the Annales Annes were directed. So lying on the couch, that's what you would see ahead of you at all times. So if we return, no, I don't want to do that, to complete the tour of Bergassa 19 and the consulting room to consider what the Viennese Freud looked at as he listened, we may be surprised to find on the wall opposite to his chair not only another cabinet cluttered with antiques, collections of pots and Egyptian statuettes, but this is where the print of Charcot's Tuesday lectures hung in front of him. As you can see it on the wall here. Fascinated by this picture, Freud's daughter Matilda asked her father what was wrong with the fainting woman. Freud replied, "Too tightly laced." A wonderfully ambiguous reply, which introduces into the study of hysteria Freud's major hypothesis about the sexual etiology of the disturbance that afflicted women, rendered mute by the dominant ideologies of sexual difference in Western modernity. If Freud so long grasped intuitively through the objects left by older civilizations that death was the defining anxiety and desired end, he equally tracked the life force, the energy that would seek pleasure and thus leave a trace of life through sexuality and procreation. Too tightly laced takes its metaphor from contemporary fashion, which encased in metal and whalebone a female body that was both stimulated and suppressed by that corset, a body both interred in clothing and fetishistically eroticized by it. It signals the conflict between the social and the erotic, again staged across the body of image as woman. And this leads us finally to a curious trio at the foot of the couch, within the view of the dreaming, regressing Anne Lizand. The first is a photograph, as you can see, of, now, which way do I have to go, of Ingres' painting. There you are. The famous 1808 painting of Oedipus and the Sphinx. This is almost too predictable because of the over-publicizing of Freud's notion of the Oedipus complex. This image holds a core legend before us in a singular visualization. If Freud slowly discerned, resisting as it appeared before him through analysis, the potency of infantile desire addressed to the mother, with a concomitant desire for the father and hostility, competitive, rivalrous hostility to both parents as rivals for the child's bisexual desires, how could images that, like the ones that fired Schliemann or figured in Freud's nightmare, so blatantly reveal the repressed? What do they remember for us? As George Dimicus pointed out, Freud's project was to transform into a tragic narrative of incomplete desire the single moment condensed in Ingres' painting, the asking of a riddle with an answer that narratively plotted a development, not a stratification. The riddle is concerns the formation of human subjectivity between the material moments of infantile dependency and physical decline to death. The riddle, of course, is what starts on 4 legs, then walks on 2, and ends on 3. This is the allegory of the ages of the human being, with a moment of upright, rational self-knowledge as the key. But Ingres' image tells us much more, not about a progression from the childish to the adult and decline into old age and decrepitude, but about a layering of subjectivity in which no stage is lost, but becomes the substrata of the next, recurring in uncanny hallucination for which art here finds measured form. Ingres' painting centers itself on the perfect nudity of the Apollonian man, posed to emphasize reflection and thought, while the edges of the painting, the world in which this self is framed, imagines for us the darkness of a lack of self-knowledge, a darkness over which presides the monstrous hybrid, the semi-human female figure, only partially separated from an animalistic inhuman world, like the Pan and Centaur in Freud's Pompeian fragments behind his head in his consulting room. Those who fail to answer the enigma this creature knows, the riddle this breasted, this maternal she poses to the middle-term man, fresh from the murder of his own father, are eaten, are consumed, are reincorporated, reversing the separation at his birth, reversing the child's milky cannibalism at her breast. In this death, woman takes back into herself what was born from her. To stay that horrific reclamation, Oedipus must see only his self-delusion in the mirror of her difference, even while he simultaneously crouches, leans upon his spears, and yet appears to be a standing figure. Behind him, in the counter-pictorial scheme of a flowing curve or drapery, the broken outline is the broken outline of a citation of a famous pose of energy from Pollaiolo's Hercules slaying the Hydra. A man embodies anxiety and dread. wishing to flee this place for the safety of the man-made geometric architecture of the city as the antithesis of the uncanny evocation of our earliest dwelling, signified by the natural formation of the cave. But let us pause just here, the lower left. Beyond the signature and date, painted above the sun-dried skeleton and skull, the memento mori, where a single horrific, still fleshly foot rises from the darkness, detached from an unseen corpse, a recent victim, we must assume. The soul of this foot, this fragment, not dried nor bony, so recently living yet already unnaturally pale, calls to the large image that Freud placed above to its right. The cast of a bas-relief he encountered in the Vatican Museum on a visit there in September 1907. Sigmund Freud reported in a letter to his wife written from Rome that he had come across a dear familiar face. It was not a real acquaintance who was thus affectionately described, but this sculpted relief, high on the wall, in which another bare-souled foot will claim our attention. The sculpted relief of a running, walking woman should cause us to pause, despite its lack of mythic framing. It may tell us more about the role of the image in psychoanalysis and art history. The relief was familiar to Freud as a real object that inspired a delusion in a story invented by the minor German writer Wilhelm Jensen in his novel Gradiva, published in 1903. Brought to Freud's attention by Jung, whom Freud had not yet met in person, in the summer of 1906 because of the use of dreams within the story, just 6 years after the publication of Interpretation of Dreams, the novella inspired Freud's first sustained engagement with a literary or artistic text, the collaboration of analyst and imaginative fiction about archaeology that burst the bounds of both to present us with the puzzle of the image in relation to memory and memory loss, repression in the way that adds a further twist to thinking about art, anthropology, and archaeology. Now, were I to invite you to stay for several more hours, I would give you a little digression here on Mary Douglas's theories of the value of forgetting, the necessity and inevitable movement of culture depending upon people misremembering, in order to frame this particular reading that I want to just give to conclude of Freud's first essay on art. The point, of course, is fundamentally links with what I was saying before about culture's obsession to hold us to the past, to create museums which present us with the canons and traditions beyond which we are not allowed to go, in the name of which feminism or any other critical discourse is seen to be, in a sense, alien discourse, an alien interruption of the preserved, always to be past. So misremembering, re-remembering, transforming and forgetting are, I think, a very important critical operation. Now, the bas-relief above the couch, the bas-relief above the couch at Bergassa 19 that dwarfs the tiny photograph of Ang's Oedipus that we have here is an uncharacteristic fragment of a figure in movement associated with the ancient dance and ritual connected with the graces or the horai. And it stands in for an important article by Freud written in the summer of 1906, which is the reading of the 1903 novella. Now, the novella is about an archaeologist called Norbert Hanold, who becomes deluded, trapped neurotically with the dead in order to avoid the living, with science in order to avoid eroticism, with marble in stone in order to escape the inadmissible attraction of living flesh. Norbert Hanold, enamored from adolescence by the science of archaeology, encounters this relief and becomes obsessively fascinated. He builds a fantasy around it. He imagines that it is not Roman, but of a Hellenistic girl. Maybe she lived in Pompeii at the time of its destruction. Intrigued above all by her gait, he rushes out into the street of the German town in which he lives to observe young women's feet, to see if such is a woman's natural stride, only to be laughed at and derided for running around peering under women's skirts like a demented fetishist. He has a dream that this girl was alive in Pompeii on the day of its destruction in 79 before the Common Era, and Norbert himself is a witness. On waking from his dream, he is unnerved, and when he thinks he sees this same girl in the street of his German hometown, he becomes restless and takes a journey, where? To Italy, and unwittingly finds himself in Pompeii. Here, in the midday sun, he meets a girl whom he takes to be the revenant of the girl in the bas-relief about whom he has fantasized so intensely. He addresses her in Greek and then tries Latin. Although she replies in contemporary German, the illusion is not broken. At this point, a reader is not clear whether she is reading a ghost story. But soon it is made clear to the reader that the girl is in fact a living German contemporary who already knows Norbert. It transpires that she was his childhood companion, who gradually fell in love with him as they grew up, while he swerved away from erotic involvement into archaeology and erotic amnesia in science. Through gentle wordplay, the young woman slowly cures Norbert of his delusion, and at the end of the novella they meet as desiring adults, allowing the flow of erotic and affectionate connection. Freud comments on the finale of the novel using the simile of the childhood friend dug out of the ruins, and then I quote, he writes, "The author has presented us with the key to the symbolism of which the hero's delusion made use in disguising his repressed memory. There is in fact no better analogy for repression by which something is preserved than the burial of the sort to which Pompeii fell victim, and from which it could emerge once more through the work of spades. Thus it was that the young archaeologist was obliged in his fantasy to transport to Pompeii the original of the relief which reminded him of the object of his youthful love. Jensen was well justified indeed in lingering over the valuable simplicity which his delicate sense had perceived between mental process in the individual and an isolated historical event in the history of mankind." Now the hinge of the novella and Freud's psychoanalytical demonstration of it is this foot. The foot rising almost perpendicularly from the pavement as the young woman works, gently holding up her flowing skirts, might immediately bring to mind something more obviously Freudian, fetishism, and no doubt it is endowed with that quality of inherited and displaced association with female sexuality and its necessary phallicization as a defense, behind which stands the forbidden body of the phallic and then castrated mother. Thus this foot stands, excuse the pun, in a relation to the pubic triangle, incised so confidently on either the Trojan or the Cycladic figures and their old European ancestors, pointing to a radically different cultural order and its visual relation, or its relation to the visualization of the maternal matrix. I just show you another section of this work, which is about the Cycladic figures who come in, and I just show you them lying down, which they should be, instead of trying to stand them up as they always are in museums. And this axis is crucial for, in a sense, the meaning of this image in relation to the earth. Actually, I'll go back. But the foot is also, if I can go back, a condensed and displaced image of a word that gave the sculpture its name and the novella its title, Gradiva. And even here there is a vital link with art and archaeology via psychoanalysis. For the making of an image is connected with an invisible thought, endowed with emotional or affective intensity, not with the transcription of the visible world. For Freud, the mental apparatus transforms memory traces into what he calls thing presentations, closer to perceptual modes, which are later joined by word presentations that allow the memory trace, endowed with affective association, to rise to the level of thought and consciousness. Dreams are particularly significant because they operate across these two modes, often translating thoughts barred from consciousness, censored or repressed by conflicting forces, into images that are imaginatively experienced as sensory, such as heat, thirst, or sight. Although it appears that we regress to archaic modes, it's more a matter of a translation or circumvention based on the always present effects of repression. Thus a word in a dream is a rebus, itself an image of a thought that may need to be untangled down a series of overdetermined signifying chains. Just so is the word gradiva, which seems on the surface to describe the lively gait of a sculpted Roman maiden. In fact, it is a veiled allusion to the person known to the archaeologist around whom once arose the premature erotic feelings that are now barred from consciousness. Meaning a sprightly gait, gradiva is simply the Latin feminine version of the surname of the young woman Zoe Bertgang. Bertgang in German means sprightly gait. It's the same word. Zoe, however, means in Greek life, and thus down a chain of signifiers is she linked with Chava, the mother of all living things, known to the Christian world as Eve. Zoe stands for life and sexual possibility in a chain that encodes both ancient respect and Christianocentric fear of women. Yet the uncognized memory trace of this living neighbor of the archaeologist is transposed onto a metal sculpture of a woman the archaeologist, inflamed like Schliemann by his fantasies about the buried, recovered city of Pompeii, transposes to an ashen funerary grave, to an earth tomb from which his desire may or may not resurrect her. In fact, Hanold has a dream in which he encounters this Bertgang gradiva woman on the day of the eruption. He imagines she moves to a temple bench and lies down, gradually turning pale and petrifying as ash descends and buries her. When, as a result of agitation persisted in waking from this dream, young Norbert goes to Pompeii and encounters his German neighbor Zoe, his delusion leads him to imagine he is encountering the ghost of she who died in his dream, although the point of the dream is to tell him that she is actually living in the same time as him, i.e. she's not in Pompeii with him, but is in this German town with him. In Pompeii, however, Hanold asks the apparition to assume the pose he witnessed in the dream, only to be rudely repelled as the living young woman recognizes instantly what the posture he invites her to adopt as a remembered pose actually signifies in a more mundane erotic sense. Would you please come and lie down and play dead? Isn't usually an invitation most of us respond to as a chat-up line. Freud's essay on Jensen's story holds much importance for our thinking about Freud and archaeology and Freud and art history. And in her study of Freud's aesthetics, Sarah Kaufman, and I am coming towards the end, calls it a pivotal work. The Gradiva essay Kaufman writes is the narrative account of a riddle which figures in miniature the riddle constituted by the work of art as such. Freud appears to merely interpret a few dreams in the text, but what he does is to inquire into the nature of poetic production itself. For Kaufman sees Freud staging and moving through a double session in his text, almost a reflection of his own intellectual journey. Firstly, Freud is the double of Norbert Hanold. He is the collector, a professional man fascinated by the art of the past. Then Freud also becomes the double of the author, whom he at first compliments, admiring the author for his insights into those mental processes that the young discipline of psychoanalysis was only just beginning to name in the formal realm of psychoanalysis. But then Freud identifies two moments of poetic license on the author's part that are needed for the novella's plot to work. He uses them to turn the tables on the author himself. The author is not really a self-analyst. Rather, Freud comes to show that the artwork is more like a symptom. Freud says that Jensen does not fully understand what he is writing, and he shows that the author is unconscious of the actual desire that his text is shaped to speak. Freud gets rid of a surface analysis for a structural method. He compares a range of words of Jensen, identifying the recurrence of certain motifs across his novels, particularly these apparitions in the midday sun of dead women, therefore pointing to the core of Jensen's work as an endless return to the problem of death and resurrection. By giving aesthetic form to some buried trace from the author's past, repetition lets into representation repressed childhood fantasies without ever their source being known. Thus, says Freud, the author ceases to be father of his own text and is revealed to be more like the analysand on the couch, offering up his artistic text as a dream. Like Oedipus, Norbert Hanold, or William Jensen, They may solve certain riddles, but fail to recognize the Pompeii within. Just want to get one. Oops, no, I need that one. In the novel, however, there is an analyst figure who forms a third double, if you can be a third double, for Freud, and it's a woman, Zoe Bertgang herself, to whom Freud turns in his final chapter. He names her a physician and notes that she, like the analyst, performs three critical tasks. She raises buried unconscious thoughts to the surface, she makes the interpretation coincide with the cure, she awakens feelings restoring affect and desire. Thus Zoe is the archaeologist with a psychological difference, and that difference is her acknowledgement of the circle of hermeneutics, precisely what psychoanalysis offers. She alone unravels the web of delusion, and Freud thus sets up a parallel between dreams, delusions, and poetic texts. Same metaphors, same terms, describe them as riddles to be deciphered. But psychoanalysis, in the end, does not offer a science or content for human consciousness. It provides a provisional, still troubled and faulty method for working with human subjectivity that it poses as a complex interweaving of corporeal, imaginary and symbolic registers. In Freud's reading of the novella Gradiva, the dead lost object, the revenant, is replaced by the intellectually acute and empathetic Zoe, a feminine sight of a deeper knowledge necessary to release Norbert back into a living rapport. At the end of the story, when the lovers are reconciled and engaged, Norbert asks her one last time to trip across the paving stones of Pompeii, revealing the famous gate. Clearly meant ironically, it serves as a warning for the fixation of the image that leads to fetishism, against which even the living intelligence of women investigators cannot stand. And I want to end with another chain of associations which takes us to this foot, the three graces of Canova, where we find this foot. Oh, well, I shouldn't find them there. Okay, right. The foot has obviously gone missing. Here it is. It seems to appear once again in Canova, and this is the point at which I wish to conclude. I found it in this work of a contemporary Brazilian artist, Ana Maria Maiolino, in the piece called Entre Vidas, used as the cover of Catherine de Zeger's monumentally important exhibition book, Inside the Visible, an elliptical traverse of 20th century art in, of, and from the feminine. This exhibition was a work of feminist archaeology of the 20th century, of modernity, rediscovering and reconnecting the cultural inscriptions of sexual, national, and cultural difference that had been forgotten, repressed, and ignored almost as fast as they had been made. In a sense, we all live in rooms like Freud's, populated at times by our own choices of revenants and mementos, and at other times by those selected and scripted by dominant cultural formations. We call these museums, art history. The archaeological discoveries that altered late 19th century Europe's sense of time and thus of history coincided with Freud's revisioning of the time and place of subjectivity. His rooms suggest, however, that the spaces and spatializations of the subjective time that can produce the museum display, or they can produce a kind of analytical écriture. We can either have Norbert Hanold or Zoe Bertgang, and I think I'm going with her. Thank you very much. No, that's fine.
Okay, do we have some questions?
Oh. I'm sorry, I'm going to go. Yeah, it's all right. I mean, there's a whole. They just have to turn them off.
Yeah, is it on?
You have to squeeze it, turn it.
Is it on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yes, you present an interesting archaeological excavation, I guess, of the two rooms. I'm wondering, I mean, what it would be to focus less on the objects that were very consciously positioned in that space, and instead pick up on what Benjamin refers to as the optical and unconscious, that which wasn't so consciously positioned. And whether there's a danger in kind of going into a kind of a hermeneutics, a very deliberate hermeneutics of the reading of those positionalities. You're going to be losing the possibilities that psychoanalysis itself would do in terms of not looking at the intentions in that obvious way and more looking at the effect.
What was I mean, I thought that's what I was doing. I thought that I was doing a reading of. Well, yes, I said it was like a dream text. I mean, since that what I was trying to say, there is some meaning that can be derived from this arrangement. I wasn't suggesting that this is a meaning that Freud actively constructed.
But it seems to me that I mean, the Anneliese on the couch is letting forth an unconscious, whatever it is. But these objects were very deliberately arranged around the space of the room. Very consciously arranged around the space of the room.
I mean, this is the, well, I mean, it seems to me that what those photographs provide us with, and I mean, if I go back to August Eichhorn was the guy who got Engelmann to come along the road and take these photographs because he knew this would be lost forever, that it is accumulated history. It's not like, Freud sort of thought, well, what shall I do with an analytic room? I mean, I actually had an example of Anna Freud's room, which is, I think now analysts think that they have to set up the room, in a certain way because of those photographs, right? And when you look at Anna Freud's consulting room, it's clearly a piece of interior design strategically placed. I think what we've got when we look at those is, in a sense, the history of Freud's own collecting, accumulation, piling up, clutter, accretion. Possibly the choice of this Chinese philosopher in front of his cigars is something that one could say is particularly deliberate. But I think the whole series of readings that are being made of these rooms, I think the Maresfield Gardens is when he had to start again and say, okay, what am I going to do? What will I put in my room? Whereas I think what we've got is 1895, I think, or whenever it is they started living there, through to 1938, you have the building of a script. I think that's what they looked like to me, as rooms where things just arrived, and it's just rather like, if I started reading my room, my study, blue tack, stick that up, I need to remember that, that's nice, etc. At the end of the day, you say, what is this? What have I actually done? Some of it might be deliberate, but I think the idea is that even beyond the deliberateness, there is an unconscious, a certain script, which was what I was trying to use as a way to kind of go in kind of like a hypertext through each one to see what other sets of relationships were being encoded in that surface organization. Not to give a reading, but to allow the kind of movement. So I don't know this, this is not a deliberate, conscious, designed interior. It therefore bears the traces of his history.
There may be a kind of empirical way of kind of resolving the issue because there's like a third site at stake, which is initially Freud doesn't go into Maresfield Gardens. He goes into a site in Elsfield, goes to Elsfield Road or Elsfield Gardens, like immediately after Anschluss. So maybe one could like insert the intermediate site kind of as an architectural question. Sorry, does anyone have? Yeah.
There's another archaeological metaphor in Freud that comes up twice in this text, and that is the Etruscan tomb that he wished to be buried, and that was his ultimate actually, which comes up twice in the interpretation of dreams and the future of the illusion. And I was wondering what you could make of that, because it's kind of a different
Mm-hmm. This sort of, I mean, this goes into, I suppose, the sort of other areas that have these particular traces in the text of the uncanny, where he casually allows there to be what he calls Mutterleibsfantasien, that this fantasies of the mother's body, and says anytime anybody goes somewhere and says, I think I've been there before, that it's some kind of memory of this, for instance, primal home, this primal interiority, for which obviously any dreams of burial seem to kind of connect with. But I don't know, it seems to in some sense, the Etruscan one, with it particularly also the sort of the figures on the sarcophagi, with sort of, in a sense, retaining this human form. It's the refusal of the return and disintegration. But the thing is, what I'm trying to kind of avoid, or at least trying to find a way to get round to, is not to tie the feminine in those terms back to the prehistoric, the beginning, the sort of beyond language, but in a sense to allow it to have constituted a cultural order proposing different sets of relationships and possibilities for subjectivity. That's, you know, that's why I'm trying to deconstruct. So this idea of the prehistoric isn't prehistoric; it's another structure, and that the violence of the destruction of the Minoan one leaves us in a sense of seeing that there's a violence involved in wrenching us from one to the other, more violent obviously for the feminine subject and less investments. And therefore, Freud sort of touches on it, but the level of the repression of that meaning, to turn us, for it just to be burial or the tomb, whatever, loses the sense in which that architectural, that elevation of the archaic memory of interiority to architecture, to a symbolic form, which is what I was trying to get with the Zoe Burt gang. She's actually going somewhere. This transformation. It is into the production of meaning and representation. So that's what I think. It's sort of this kind of primal hominess allows the feminine only to be a kind of beyond of culture, or big before time, a space before time, as opposed to a kind of a space of a certain kind of structuring of subjectivity or meaning, and possibly therefore one to which we could move.
Well, while people are waiting to make up their questions, I mean, since you deal with this evening with all the psychoanalytic questions, let me kind of be entirely to one side and ask you an entirely art historical question. When you now look again at Gradiva and the raised foot, I'm thinking while I'm kind of watching that image, would you see the foot in the same way if it weren't in relationship, and this is a non-Freudian question, would you see it in such a way if it weren't for the agitated drapery? Now, the moment you say agitated drapery, it brings us, as it were, to a slightly kind of different route of thinking about this, that of Abby Warburg, who interprets from antiquity through the Renaissance those moments of agitated drapery as a certain kind of sign, not here immediately of the sexual, but, in a Nietzschean sense, like of the Dionysiac. And, if one were to sort of say one of the failings of Freud, like as an art historian, he zooms into what he's interested in. He's not really... But one wonders whether Warburg mightn't be right, that it's the agitated drapery that has first drawn his attention to the raised ankle and its significance, or at least it seems to me like an interesting way of thinking about how your attention is drawn to a detail.
I did, because this is part of a great long book that is sort of growing in parts, as we just flashed through the slides, I would have liked to have, in a sense, got to Warburg's library as another kind of architectural and intellectual space in terms of kind of arrangements which come back to your circle and your circle of hermeneutics. So Warburg was on my mind, and that would be precisely where we would go in terms of, let me put it this way, flashing from the foot of Gradiva to the use of that foot in Canova's Three Graces is enabled, measures the distance between the culture of which Gradiva is what in Warburg's terms a pathos formula, a kind of a trace, an image form that is a trace of a certain, put it very crudely, sort of emotion. That's to say, in the sense that the arguments that art originates in ritual originates in a certain kind of management of emotion. And then, since the trace of that emotion is actually established in some kind of form of gesture or expression that carries it forward, and the culture no longer remembers the emotional matrix from which that form arose, they just have that, so that we're already in a state where some kind of freezing and losing. Now that the Canova, because they're naked figures, is precisely where the attention to the foot has then, as it were, colonized a whole, in a sense, sort of logic of representation that we know of when we talk about the nude in Western art, whereas Gradiva is on the edge because it hinges back to, the thing is that this particular bas-relief is thought to be one of three which takes us back to the Graces. Now the Graces are unbelievably interesting, the Carités, in terms of this kind of 19th century moment when archaeologists, classical archaeologists, became very influenced by Nietzsche into beginning to develop this ritual theory of art. So I think you're right in the sense that the drapery is precisely the thing that sort of would hold that image on that cusp between those two orders, whereas the Canova has completely taken it into this petrified, Marmorian, fetishized kind of construction of the erotic, as opposed to what that fluttering drapery, that interruption, that movement, that trace of dance, and therefore the traits of dance, the trace of a certain kind of, I suppose in a sense, performance of the struggle between Eros and Thanatos, which was so caught up in those ancient rituals, which is completely then evacuated into what I see the kind of the neoclassical kind of fixity and stillness. And you even get it it's already there in the Raphael Three Graces, where they kind of, stand there with these perfect things that gaze, as opposed to the animation stuff. And in that sense, when you go back and to the whole thing about all the movements and the processions and the dance that they come from. So I think you're right, since that holds, but not just, it's not just what attracts him, but it's, I'm not saying this very kind of coherently, but it's, I think what Warburg was trying to say, it holds before us, as I'm trying to say, this question of the mnemic trace, which is also the means of oblivion. And therefore, the issue is not what did it originate in, but what bits you read for, whether you read, as I was trying to say at the end, for the movement of the foot, or you read the foot as this kind of the sort of the trace of what is denied. That's what becomes for Hanold the fetish, but for Zoe Bertgang is this figure of a movement through history which is backwards and forwards, so that we don't kind of say, oh, if only we go back to when things was like that, as opposed to what does it mean to us to interpret that now. And that's why I was concerned to juxtapose psychoanalysis with art history and archaeology and anthropology, that this whole cluster of discourses around pasts and memory and history coincide, and unless they get juxtaposed, I mean, I'm afraid, institutionally, art history and the histories of our disciplines, whether it's architecture or visual culture, whatever, etc., is rooted in this apparent teleology, which is actually like the foot frozen in place. And we fetishize the object, not the movement that comes from thinking.
Literal pedagogy.
There you go, yes.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, I can sort of tell from the room it's been an enormous interest, everyone here. Griselda, I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you.